Howdy, I'm Matilda Whitetail, director and lead designer at Dear Cosmos. Welcome to another chronological recap of recent space missions by the Union of Cervid Capitalist Republics. As usual, we will also cover events from our rivals, the Allied Territorial Federation, when relevant. The number of historic events recently has been staggering, so today's presentation is our longest yet. Starting off, the ATF's Seafarer 2 probe became the first Kerbal-made object to fly by our starward neighbor, Eve. It even briefly dipped into the planet's atmosphere before coasting back out to space. It launched during the last Eve transfer window atop a Catalyst rocket for its first stage and a modified Centauri upper stage. The probe was equipped with radiometers to measure the atmosphere without entering it, as Seafarer 2 was originally planned to only come within 120 kilometers of Eve. However, the second stage correction burn fired slightly longer than intended, and the periapsis was lowered to 89 kilometers. When it activated the radiometers, some believed they had malfunctioned, as they showed atmospheric pressures far exceeding predictions. But when the probe passed through the atmosphere, it experienced heating and drag consistent with the pressures it recorded. It appears Eve's atmosphere is much thicker than previously believed. Seafarer 2 was a monumental first for interplanetary exploration, and plans for our own Eve flyby are now being altered to involve an intentional atmospheric entry and possibly even a landing attempt. Howdy Potato, welcome to the stream. Minhart 11 was launched with the same flight profile as Minhart 8, discussed last time. It performed a flyby of Minmus, conducting some experiments, and returned to the surface of Kerbin. While Minhart 8 was still considered a success, its partial break-apart during the entry left half of its experiments destroyed before they could be recovered. Minhart 11 featured a redesigned return module that was more compact to be better protected by the heat shield. Despite being smaller, the new camera suite also added an infrared camera in addition to the visible and ultraviolet spectrums. With Minhart 11 safely splashing down off the western shore, completely intact, plans are being made to launch a similar mission in the future that will capture into an actual orbit of Minmus for more targeted experiments before returning. As discussed in the last report, the ATF's recent test launch of their Phobos command module, a craft intended to carry 3 Kerbals to the moons. Their test was only in low Kerbin orbit, as, like us, they do not yet have a lift vehicle strong enough to carry it all the way to the moons. Still, this test brought the ATF ahead of us in the race to land Kerbals on the moons as far as the public could see. In response, we conducted a low Kerbin orbit test of our own equivalent vessel, based on the Stato OVA, or Orbital Vessel Active. The new Stato LOV, or Lunar Orbital Vessel, has been modified to carry 2 Kerbals to the moons and back. Much like the Phobos command module, it is intended to remain in orbit of either moon, while a separate vessel detaches to perform the landing. The lander will then fly back so the crew can reunite in the LOV and then fly home without the lander craft. Compared to the Stato OVA used in previous Stato missions, the LOV features several changes. The fuel tanks have been expanded, the antennas rearranged, and an external handrail has been added. The solar panels have been removed and replaced with a fuel cell to ensure power can be generated even in complete shadow. And lastly, the docking system has been redesigned. Unlike the docking ports on the Stato OVA and OVP, the passive variant of the OVA, the LOV and its lander's docking ports will not allow crew transfer. This reduces weight and simplifies the docking mechanism, but will require a short spacewalk to transfer crew between them. An acceptable trade-off with weight at a premium. The first Stato LOV launched on a ROG 5B as Stato 4 and going forward, no more Statos will launch on the pre-B Rock 5. Unlike the ATF's Phobos, our vessel is light enough that a new, more powerful lift vehicle wasn't necessary. And because the LOV is based on the Stato and launched on a Rock 5, both well proven, we did not need to perform an unmanned test first like the ATF did. Indeed, Stato 4 launched a day after Phobos 2 launched with the crew on board. The fact the LOV is such a close development of the OVA is largely why we hadn't tested it up to this point. While the test would need to be done eventually, it was mostly seen as a formality rather than a real test. All of the mission-critical components had already proven reliable before, so the final test in low Kerbal orbit was pushed down the road to occur once the super heavy lift vehicle was ready. The only reason the test was instead performed now was due to the public perception that we had fallen behind. In the future, we will not allow such a perception to catch on again, and test flights will not be postponed solely for convenience. Stato 4 flew without any problems, tested all of its systems in orbit, and safely returned both Kerbals on board. The ATF made another reveal recently, although less televised. Their new interceptor jet, the F-601 Sharp Spear, has been spotted by our Ru-1B spy planes. Indeed, the Sharp Spear comes much closer to shooting down our spy planes than their last interceptors, although they are still only able to reach us in a ballistic arc, and cannot maintain a high enough altitude to follow. Still, our pilots will have to be more careful, and flight plans will need to be more carefully considered. In Vietnam, the ATF have begun fielding a new infantry rifle, designated the XM-15, and designed by the Oliver Repeating Arms Company. The rifle is largely a copy of their current main infantry rifle, the M14. It has a traditional wood stock, a 20-round aluminum detachable magazine, and is select fire. It differs by having a simplified gas system, a slightly shorter 508mm barrel, and most prominently, the entire rifle is scaled down to fire a new intermediate rifle cartridge, and is 1.27 kilograms lighter, at 2.9 kilograms unloaded. The new cartridge, shown in the middle here, has a 5.56mm projectile and a 45mm case. Compared to the M14's cartridge, shown at the bottom, which has a 7.62mm projectile and a 51mm case length. The new cartridge and rifle seem to be a response to UCCR-made AG-52 rifles in use by the North Vietnamese forces. Comparing the ATF cartridge to the cartridge used in our AG-52, shown on the top here with a 7.62mm projectile and 39mm case length, you can see that they are of close overall size. The ATF cartridge has a noticeably smaller projectile, however, and produces a much higher muzzle velocity from an equivalent length barrel. So far, the XM15 seems to be in an extensive field trial stage, undergoing testing across all branches of the ATF's armed forces in Vietnam. It seems the intent is to supplement the M14 rather than fully replace it. Its light recoil allowing for much more controllable automatic fire in the close engagement distances of the jungle, while the M14 continues to be used for long-range accuracy and single-shot power. Of course, retaining the M14 will likely be a detriment to them in the long run. Even outside the jungle, our studies have shown engagement distances beyond 300 meters are increasingly rare. Still, it seems they have begun catching up to our rifleman doctrine focused around intermediate rifles within that distance. A small number of XM15s and their ammunition have been captured and sent to the UCCR for study. The small caliber high velocity ammunition is of particular interest for its low recoil and flatter trajectory. The ROG-8 ICBM has continued development. The first test flight was flown south over the Atlantic Ocean and tested both distance and accuracy. On the first stage, one of the three dual-nozzle engines and one of the Werner engines failed, but thanks to its redundant design, the stage still carried the missile out of the atmosphere. But then, the main engine of the second stage also failed. Again, the missile proved resilient, as the four Werner engines alone were enough to propel the dummy payload into a ballistic trajectory to hit its target, with only a minor correction burn from the re-entry vehicle. While the re-entry vehicle had issues with stability during re-entry and flipped over, it still survived and impacted the Atlantic Ocean on target. Having proved successful, a test with a live warhead was authorized. The flight path called for flying north to the Siberian tundra, where the detonation could be observed and measured. This meant flying over populated areas of the UCCR. For the safety of the people, an abort system was added to the test ROG-8. In the event anything went wrong, the warhead would be disarmed, jettisoned from the missile, and parachuted safely to the surface for recovery. This feature will, of course, not be present on any actual production ROG-8s, as we do not want an abort system that could be hacked by the enemy. The flight had 0 engine failures and flew perfectly up until re-entry. Like the previous test, the re-entry vehicle flipped over, but this time it burned up in the atmosphere. For the third test, additional RCS thrusters were added to keep the re-entry vehicle stable. But a fault in the fuel lines prevented them from firing, and again it flipped and burned up. On the fourth test, the fault in the RCS was fixed. The re-entry vehicle remained stable, and the 12 megaton payload successfully detonated at the target site in Siberia. At long last, the ROG-8 was ready, and the design was handed over to contractors to be mass-produced for the military. The contract payout was then directly put into the Munosled and Minsled programs. In another response to the ATF's, this time non-military rockets, we developed our first heavy-lift launch vehicle, the DR-500. Aiming to achieve a similar capability as their Sarnas 1B, the DR-500 will be able to launch larger landers and rovers to the surface of the moons, large satellites to lunar orbit, satellites to high Kerbal orbit, and even a manned capsule on a flyby of the moon, though it will not have enough to carry a lander. The first launch, Stato-5, carried a Stato LOV and was intended to be an unmanned test to send the vessel around the moon and back to Kerbal. Unfortunately, one of the engines in the first stage failed and shut down quickly after takeoff. The offset thrust from these side-mounted engines made the tilt impossible to recover from. The abort system activated and successfully pulled the empty capsule away to safety, and where it opened its parachute. It did not, however, shut down the engines. The DR-500 was almost completely destroyed, as the fuel tanks detonated on impact with the ground. While only 15 to 20% of the fuel actually detonated, the resulting explosion was estimated to be equivalent to approximately 8 to 13 tons of TNT. This makes it the largest accidental spaceflight-related explosion to date. Nevertheless, testing the DR-500 would continue. Hi, Batva. Welcome in. Minkopita 1 was to be the second launch of the DR-500, and was intended to carry our first rover to Minmus. Unfortunately, it too experienced a first-stage engine failure. This time, the abort system had been revised and was able to shut down the remaining engines. Most of the second stage was intact, as much less of the fuel exploded this time. Miraculously, despite no launch escape system being fitted, the rover itself survived completely unscathed. A full examination was done by our engineers, and no significant damage of any kind was found. Still, the decision was made to play it safe, and an entire new rover would be constructed. Minkopita 1 would instead be donated to the National Cosmonautics Museum. Munosled 1 would be a second attempt at Stato-5's mission, now under the name of our Manned Moon Landing Program. Between this and the last DR-500 launch, a test bed had been used to gather data on the performance and failures of the lifter's engines. Unfortunately, the anchors securing the engines failed while the test bed was firing, and it was subsequently destroyed before the test could be concluded. Not wanting to delay the next launch, Munosled 1 was given the go-ahead, with adjustments made to the engines based on the results of the partial test. The first stage experienced no problems, but one of the 4 second-stage engines failed and shut down. Despite this, thanks to all of the DR-500's engines having 360-degree gimbaling, the second stage was still able to complete its burn. Once outside the atmosphere, the engine opposite of the one that had failed was shut down to regain symmetrical thrust. The second stage was able to carry the uncrewed Stato LOV to the Moon and capture into an orbit. After completing a few orbits, the second stage was set on a collision course with the Moon, and the Stato's own engine was used to transfer back into a Kerbal orbit. However, the Stato's engine failed while burning to escape the Moon's sphere of influence. Normally, an engineer on board could easily be able to fix this. However, since this was an unmanned test flight, there was no crew on board to perform said fix. Instead, the Stato completed the burn using its RCS thrusters. This meant it would be burning with less fuel efficiency than originally planned for, but the flight path was to remain unaltered for the purposes of the test. On the eventual manned mission, the plan is for the Stato to capture back into orbit around Kerbal, rather than capture into a direct descent. While this is less fuel efficient, it allows the craft to easily choose its landing position, important for ensuring the crew don't land in hostile territory. The low thrust of the RCS meant the burn to lower the apoapsis around Kerbal had to be split over multiple orbits, but the vessel was able to reach a slightly eccentric, low orbit before running out of fuel. Another attempt to land a rover on Minmus, Minkapita 2, launched on another DR-500. The faults with the first stage having been thoroughly solved, and the success of the lift vehicle side of Munosled 1 led to confidence that this launch would go smoothly. Unfortunately, 3 of the 4 second-stage engines failed back-to-back, making recovery impossible. The vessel subsequently crashed into the Atlantic Ocean. The goal of Stato 6 was to refuel and deorbit Munosled 1, as it would otherwise remain in orbit as space debris. Veteran crew Valentina Kerman and Bill Kerman were sent up and attempted to rendezvous with the empty Stato LOV. While unable to dock due to the different docking ports, they would still be able to station keep alongside the vessel and refuel it with a flexible hose. But, due to Munosled 1's eccentric orbit from running out of fuel before it could finish circularizing, the rendezvous was more difficult than expected, and refueling had to be aborted as Stato 6 ran dangerously low themselves. In the end, Stato 6 actually ran out of fuel just shy of re-entering the atmosphere. Not wanting to wait for a rescue craft for what was already essentially a rescue craft, the crew elected to perform a daring maneuver. Going on EVA, Bill Kerman used his entire jetpack's fuel, then reboarded to swap out his pack for Valentina's, and used all of its fuel, all while pushing the Stato. While it was just enough thrust to deorbit, the approach was much shallower than standard. This, compounded with a miscalculation in the improvised return, meant that after jettisoning the orbital and surface modules to burn up, the return capsule was found to be going at a greatly undershot trajectory, instead landing in the east of the ATF. Immediately, a rescue was put into motion. The Ru-1B, still configured for research use at the KSC, had its scientific equipment removed, and an improvised 2-seat passenger space installed in the compartment. Bill and Valentina would exit the Stato and evade capture for just a few hours until the plane could finish being modified, fly over, and land to rescue them. It was the only Cervid plane to ever fly deep into ATF airspace without being shot down, as it was. It, of course, had never attempted to land in the hostile territory, but it was our only shot. We could only hope that attempting to land would be so brazen that they wouldn't be prepared for it. Sadly, trying to avoid interception, the modified Ru-1B came into land on unpaved flat area too fast. While the drogue chutes deployed, they were not enough to prevent the front landing gear from giving away, and the cockpit collided with the ground at high speed, killing the pilot. Bill and Valentina were waiting nearby the crash and were ultimately captured by ATF authorities. Ellerik Kerman was the pilot who bravely volunteered to fly the Ru-1B for the rescue mission. She knew the immense risk of the mission and chose to fly in spite of it. She was a highly skilled pilot in the Cervid Air Force before joining Dear Cosmos and was a friend to all in the program. She will be dearly missed. For her heroic final actions, she has been posthumously awarded a Medal of Bravery and a Medal of Heroism. Rest in peace, Edward Kerman. Following their capture, negotiations began for the return of Bill and Valentina. The ATF's representative claimed that under normal circumstances, their official policy had always been that any cosmonauts that landed in the ATF would be treated well and returned to the UCCR promptly, but that the spy plane we crashed into the land was making that process difficult. Officially, these were still two separate matters, but they demanded the return of their spy, Sarah Kerman, as recompense for the plane crash, and they would conveniently give us back our cosmonauts at the same time and place. Sarah Kerman was transferred from her cell in Siberia and flown to the friendly nation of Kolska. After landing, she was loaded into a car and driven to the Kolska-Koichland border. There, the car met up with a van from Koichland, and the prisoners were exchanged. Bill and Valentina appeared to be unharmed and still in their spacesuits. They were quickly debriefed at the airport before being flown back home in comfort. All in all, not a terrible trade, losing one enemy spy to get back two of our most experienced cosmonauts. Following these events, Thompson Kerman was also officially returned to service, as the CGB is convinced at this point that his cover had not been blown. Stato-7 was a Stato-OVA specifically modified to deorbit Munosled-1. It used the already extended fuel tanks of the Stato-LOV and added an additional small tank to be used exclusively to refuel Munosled. It also featured the female docking port designed to be used on the Munosled lander. This way, the modified Stato could actually dock with the LOV for easier EVA work. This mission was engineer Kerbal Kerman's first flight and EVA. She had been undergoing training in water pools up to this point, and with Bill still on some time off after the Stato-6 ordeal, it was her time to fly. Kerbal and Thompson were able to successfully rendezvous with Munosled-1 and dock. From there, Kerbal was able to connect a hose and refueled the stranded vessel. It was decided not to bother wasting the spare parts repairing the LOV's engine, since it was destined to burn up in the atmosphere anyways. After being filled with fuel, the hose was disconnected, the LOV remotely deorbited with its RCS thrusters. With no crew on board, it was aimed to land in an uninhabited area, and the parachute wasn't deployed, so the capsule would be destroyed on impact. Kerbal and Thompson then returned home safely in Stato-7. Drink real quick. Mega Pizza 3 marked the first launch of a DR-500 with 0 faults. The first stage performed flawlessly, and the second stage carried the rover into orbit and then all the way to Midmas. While enough fuel was brought in the second stage to allow for a complete capture into Midmas orbit, a more direct landing approach was chosen, and the stage was used for the majority of that descent. This meant the actual descent stage had far more fuel than needed to safely complete the landing, and could potentially be used to refuel other craft that land near it in the future, although no plans to use this extra fuel or how it would be transferred exist currently. Landing near the North Pole, the rover rolled off the lander and performed its full suite of experiments on the minty surface. It then began driving south to perform another round of experiments in the nearby Midlands, but unfortunately the solar array failed, and the rover lost power before being able to reach its second destination. Its second and third mission objectives would have to be completed by another rover. With the Ru-1B that crashed nearly intact in ATF territory, it's only a matter of time before they reverse engineer it, and, more pressingly, learn how to shoot it down. As such, development has begun on a new spy plane capable of flying higher and faster. For the Ru-2 JSR, or Jet Strategic Reconnaissance, the fuselage had been designed as a lifting body to make up for smaller wings, providing more lift with less drag. The entire airframe is significantly larger than the Ru-1, allowing for a much greater cargo capacity. The extended cargo bay can be used to carry either much more scientific equipment, a passenger module for up to 6 Kerbals, or even tactical or strategic level bombs. The latter capability has prompted extra interest from the Air Force already. It's intended to use two new hypersonic-capable engines mounted on its wingtips, but they are not yet ready. For now, the Ru-2A variant uses two Ru-1 engines and is being used to test the rest of the plane's functions. Already, the increased thrust from two engines, even with the increased weight of the airframe, allow the JSR to climb much faster and more aggressively. The current maximum practical altitude is only a little higher than the Ru-1, being 11 kilometers, but with the new engines, it is expected to fly much higher. In its first test flight, Thompson Kerman and Bob Kerman were able to reach the Ru-1's max speed at only 75% throttle. For safety, higher speed tests had been held off until the new engine pods are ready and the plane can reach a higher altitude with lower air resistance. Surprisingly, even with these precautions, after flying 3/4 of the distance to Concow, the engine pods caught fire, and Thompson was forced to perform an emergency landing off the shore of Vietnam. Our engineers believe the temporary air intakes allowed more heat to build up in the engines than expected. Going forward, an automatic fire suppression system has been installed in each pod, and the max testing speed further reduced. On its second flight, Valentina Kerman and Anbro Kerman were able to complete the flight across the Atlantic Ocean and took some measurements with the onboard scientific equipment before one of the engines had a failure and shut down. Unable to maintain stable flight on a single engine due to how far apart they are spaced, Valentina was forced to land in a neutral nation. While not ideal, with some negotiations and payments, we were able to secure a safe and hopefully discreet return of the crew and craft. Minkapita 4 successfully touched down on Minmus icy flats only 1.8 kilometers away from Minhart 7. Again, using a direct landing approach, the rover performed all of its experiments in the biome, and, after briefly driving over to investigate the old capsized lander, drove over to the temperature fluctuations Minkapita 3 was sent to investigate as its third objective. While one of the new auxiliary solar panels broke off, the main solar array and second auxiliary panel remained fully functional. Minkapita 4 was able to move along the icy surface and make several measurements, finding the source of the fluctuations. It then drove to the nearby Midlands to complete Minkapita 3's second measurement objective, and is now awaiting further orders. Minkapita 4 is expected to provide utility on Minmus for a long time. The EATF beat us to another interplanetary probe first. Seafarer 4 was the first Kerbal-made object to fly past Duna. It launched using the same lifter configuration as previous Seafarer probes and reached a Duna periapsis just under 119,000 kilometers. This time, the probe was equipped with a camera and took several photos as it approached, two of which could be seen here, as the artist representation on the left used one of Seafarer 4's more distant photos for the background. The probe was equipped again with equipment to remotely measure the planet's atmosphere, this time using radio occultation to measure signals sent by the probe while the atmosphere was between it and the ATF's relays around Kerbal. Duna was measured having an atmospheric pressure consistent with long prevailing estimates. While thinner than Kerbin's atmosphere, Duna's is still thick enough for liquid water to potentially form on the surface, and for future lift-generating craft to be able to glide or fly above the red surface. Dear Cosmos currently has no intentions for a competing Duna probe program. However, some plans are being drafted in the event this becomes a higher priority. Lastly, the ATF have begun flying a new jet fighter bomber in the sky above Vietnam. This plane, designated the F-40 Opera II, has an airframe larger for its type, two powerful new engines, and an advanced radar in the nose. It features no guns, and instead relies solely on a large array of missiles for air-to-air combat. Its several underside pylons can hold a combination of heat-seeking missiles, radar-guided missiles, and air-to-ground bombs, making it a very well-armed and versatile craft. It is able to outspeed and climb both their previous fighter, the F-68, and our current fighter, the Ol-3. While our jets remain more maneuverable, their speed and heavy armaments still make them a big threat, and something of similar capability will need to be developed for our Air Force and our allies. Now for the world map. The front line in Vietnam has stagnated, the ATF's new rifle and planes proving effective at halting our advances. Although the South has failed to make any advances of their own. No, that's a typo. Should say, although the North has failed to make any advances of their own. Seems the tide could be tipped in either side's favor. Public opinion of the war has begun to sour in the ATF as more and more Kerbals are drafted and killed in combat. Recently, their government has begun cracking down on the televised reporting of the war, prompting even further backlash. It's possible the Federalist government will be forced to dial back their involvement of the war if things continue. Finally, we have our updated goals for Dear Cosmos. We've managed to cross off several items since last time, and we hope to continue this momentum with more shorter-term goals, in addition to our long-term manned lunar ambitions. Munokopita is already under construction to carry our first rover to the moon. Development of the Ru-2 JSR will continue as planned, and we will be designing a new jet to counter the ATF's F-40. All ball work continues in the background towards developing a super heavy lifter for the Minsled and Munosled programs.